Hello, today we're going to talk about the introduction to IST 455. The concept of taking a drug or a biologic or a device from concept to commercial product. So for next week, read Chapter 2 of our text, which is Drugs from Discovery to Approval by Rick Eng. And the text is, I like this textbook. I've got a couple others that I'll be drawing content from, as well as some articles. And the text includes discussion questions and case studies, so it's really pretty useful. So the Food and Drug Administration defines a drug as an active ingredient that is intended to furnish pharmacological activity or other direct effect in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of human disease, or to affect the structure of any function of the human body, but does not include intermediates used in the synthesis of such ingredient. So if you're synthesizing a drug, you could be doing this from precursors. So the precursors aren't the drug, it's the active ingredient of the drug that is the active pharmacological ingredient. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, also regulates cosmetics, and they refer to a cosmetic as articles intended to be rubbed, poured, sprinkled, or sprayed on, introduced into, or otherwise applied to the human body for cleaning, beautifying, promoting attractiveness, or altering the appearance. And they define a device as a means of introducing a drug into the body. So a syringe, a disposable syringe would be a device, an insulin pen or pump would be a device, a transdermal patch, a drug-eluting stent that you would put into a blood vessel that would slowly leak drug into the stent, that would be a device. So a drug can be a chemical or biological substance. A drug can be synthetic or non-synthetic. Ethical drugs require prescription by a physician. And new drugs are under patent protection, and generic drugs are drugs whose patents have expired. Over-the-counter drugs can be purchased without a prescription, so they are not an ethical drug. There's nothing unethical about them, but the term ethical drugs are the ones that require prescriptions. Over-the-counter drugs have a long history of use and are considered safe, although even an over-the-counter drug has side effects and risk factors to be considered. So when you're talking about a drug, drugs can be very confusing because they have a variety of different names. So the first name is the trade or proprietary name. For example, Nexium is the trade name for a drug that is a proton pump inhibitor. Then there's a generic or non-proprietary name. So the generic name for Nexium is esomeprazole magnesium. And the chemical name then is S-isomer of benzimidazole. So what's interesting about Nexium is that it's a second-generation drug. And Prilosec, which is an over-the-counter drug now, is a proton pump inhibitor which works well as an antacid. And it is a mixture of the S-isomer and R-isomer of benzimidazole. And Nexium is only the S-isomer, and therefore it's a different drug. So Prilosec has passed its patent and was available as a generic, and then gradually it had been used so much that it became available to be an over-the-counter drug. And Nexium you still have to have a prescription for. So I had mentioned that an API is the active pharmaceutical ingredient, and as a general rule the chemicals are small molecules, and the biologicals are proteins or other materials that are made in cells and then purified, and those biological active pharmaceutical ingredients tend to be much larger molecules than the chemicals. So I've got a graph here that I actually plotted from the global pharmaceutical sales data. And so in 2012, the global pharmaceutical sales were $9,962.1 billion in U.S. sales. And so these data are coming from the total world pharma market top-line metrics. And so these sales have grown from about 500 billion in about 2003 now to about 962 billion, almost 10 years later. So those sales then are growing at a very rapid rate. But one interesting phenomenon is that in 2012, there's a bit of a leveling off. There's still an increase in sales, but there's a bit of a leveling off of this very rapid increase in sales growth. And that's because in 2012, a number of well-selling drugs came off of patent. So drug companies are different from other high-technology businesses. They're different from the computer industry. They're different from the car industry in that these products, these biotechnology and drug products, are highly regulated. The requirement to demonstrate safety and efficacy is a long, risky, and expensive process, and it requires multiple rounds of investment in the company. So it's not, you can do a startup and be Facebook and bring out a company and make $1 billion on Facebook without anybody really regulating Facebook. But when you're a drug and you're trying to bring out a new, suppose, let's talk about a drug that doesn't exist but people would like. What if there were a male birth control pill that men could take to render them infertile? That drug would take a long time and require a lot of investment in order to be proven to be effective and safe. So while most business models are focused on developing and then making a commercial product, biotechnology and drug companies have to develop their intellectual property and then sell or license their intellectual property to larger companies who would then develop the product because they have the expertise to go through this long, expensive process. So these big drug companies have the expertise to commercialize these products, and smaller biotechnology companies or smaller drug companies are often innovating the new treatment program. So when you're looking at the drug industry, one of the big sources is an industry trade group called PhRMA, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America. Sometimes people refer to people as Big Pharma, but PhRMA is actually an industry trade group. And so they keep statistics and do a lot of lobbying on behalf of the drug manufacturers. So the leading biopharmaceutical research and biotechnology companies are members of PhRMA. And PhRMA members invested an estimated $45 billion in 2009 in research and development. And industry-wide, research and investment reached a record $65.3 billion in 2009. So not everybody's a member of PhRMA, so there's another $20 billion in research that's going on. So if you're looking at the top 10 pharmaceutical companies based on their 2012 sales, number 1 is Pfizer, number 2 is Novartis, 3 is Merck, 4 is Roche, 5 is Sanofi, 6 is GlaxoSmithKline, 7 is Johnson & Johnson, 8 is Abbott Laboratories, 9 is Eli Lilly, and 10 is Teva. So in the biopharmaceutical companies are companies that are using cell lines and bacteria to make biological compounds. So top companies include Genentech, Amgen, Gilead Science, which makes a number of compounds that are used to fight influenza, Celgene, and Biogen IDEC. So the top-selling drugs, as a general rule, are drugs that are still under patent. So I looked up the latest data, and so for the second quarter of 2013, the top-ranking sales in thousands of sales is Abilify, which comes from Otsuka Pharmaceutical Company. And Abilify is a drug that's it's an antidepressant, and it's considered to be a drug that it's still under patent, and it's potentially a drug to treat muscle pain. So Nexium, which we talked about earlier, is next in the list, and so it's selling about $1.454 billion. $1,454 million in sales. Abilify's $1.597 billion. Humira, which is another drug that's a biological, is used as an anti-infection, anti-arthritis drug. Cymbalta from Eli Lilly and Company is another drug that's used to treat depression and muscle pain. Crestor is another drug from AstraZeneca. Advair is a drug that's used to treat the lung problems and asthma. And Enbrel is another anti-immune suppressant drug from Amgen. And then the list goes on. So these are all, what these drugs share in common is that there isn't really a generic version of these drugs available. And they're new drugs that have launched, and they're drugs that they don't have as much competition. They're better drugs, so they meet an unmet market niche. So they're popular, and you can't buy them from anybody else, so they're covered by a patent. So when you look at a drug, there's kind of a life cycle. So this illustration indicates sort of the life cycle of the drug and what can happen to a drug as it's going through. And it comes from a magazine called The Scientist. So when we take this class in IST 355, one of the things we're going to do is go through all these stages and talk about them in a lot more detail. So this first lecture is an overview of how the life cycle of a drug will work. So the first thing you have to do is identify a lead candidate. You have to figure out what kind of a treatment are you trying to develop, and then screen for a drug candidate that'll be effective. And you can do this by screening for the candidate, or you can identify the target you want to inactivate and then design a drug that's going to fit in and inactivate the target molecule. So then you have to do some preclinical toxicology testing. So that can be done in vitro in cell lines initially to show that it doesn't have a toxic effect on cells growing in culture, and then you can do animal studies, usually with mice or rats. And then you'll do preliminary safety tests in humans, and then those will be your stage 1 clinical trials. And then you'll do proof of concept safety and efficacy in humans, and those will be your stage 2 trials. Then you'll try and show that there's statistically significant efficacy in humans. And then finally you'll want approvable safety and efficacy in large human trials. So you'll test it on large numbers of people, because even rare side effects may not show up in those initial trials. The drug may be a great drug, but if 1 in 10,000 people dies from it, it may not be that great a drug. So then it'll enter the marketplace and go on to either be not approved. The FDA will say not efficacious, doesn't really work, or unsafe. It may be a specialty drug with a small market, but it may still be a good drug. It may be a good drug which works well but isn't a blockbuster. And a blockbuster drug like those top 10, that's going to be a drug that really works better than its competition and meets an unmet medical need. So in these different phases then in the life cycle of a drug, there's a wide variety of costs, but all of these are quite expensive. Introducing a new drug, and I think I have a slide a little later, currently is estimated to cost as much as $5 billion. So just discovery of the drug is estimated to cost $5 million. The preclinical phases could be $5 to $10 million. Phase 1 trials, $5 to $10 million. Phase 1B, 2A would be $10 to $15 million. Phase 2B would be $15 to $25 million. Phase 3, where you're doing the large-scale trials, that would be $40 to $100 million. It costs at least $5 million to do the FDA review of all the data and work with your statisticians and physicians to put the package together to be reviewed. And then finally, it's hundreds of millions of dollars to market the drug and manufacture it and bring out large amounts of it. So if you're a company, a small startup company, and you want to discover a drug, you can raise seed money and venture capital. You might be able to do this on grants, small business grants from the National Institute of Health, and discover a compound that would make an excellent new drug. But you're going to have to raise more money, venture capital money, in order to enter preclinical. And then phase 1 trials, you might be able to still do that with venture capital. When you start entering a bigger scaled up, you're going to need growth funds to fund your work. And when you're starting to enter phase 2B and phase 3, that's when you need to potentially have public investment. So frequently what happens is a smaller company will take a drug through maybe preclinicals and phase 1 trials, and then a bigger partner company, bigger other drug company will enter and partner with them to take them through phase 2B and phase 3 and FDA review and market the drug and distribute the drug through their distribution channel. So one problem with this is that a lot of drugs are started in those discovery and preclinical phases that never make it to a human trial. So you may discover 20 drugs, but only one of those drugs may go on to become a commercial product. So you may actually be spending a lot of money on drug discovery and not necessarily taking them all out to being drugs that reach the marketplace. So the sooner you discover that a drug is not a good drug or isn't going to be good in humans, the sooner you can stop work on that one and work on one of the ones that is going to be a good drug. And I have a link here to the Forbes.com site, which was published just this past month, that talks about how some of the costs for new drugs can be as much as $5 billion per drug. And if you click on this link or look this link up, it's very interesting. Now, they mentioned some of the thriftier companies could do it in $3 billion. So, but this is an even higher number than what was on my earlier slide, which I think dates from about 2007, 2008. So one of the key things about the pharmaceutical industry for those blockbusters is that that drug needs to be covered by a patent. So Congress enacted patent laws to provide an incentive to inventors to invent and to make their inventions public. and they're going to protect the patented invention from unauthorized use. Essentially, the patents provide a right to exclude others from making, using, offering for sale, or selling your invention in the United States, or from importing the invention into the United States. So a patent basically gives you the right to prevent competition. It's a limited monopoly on the drug for the time that it's brought out. So if you go back and look at that list, the patent may cover, I think patent laws have changed recently, and now patents often cover 20 years. So you may have patented the drug early on, and then it may take you 5 to 10 years to take it through all the FDA trials, and then you've only got 10 years where your blockbuster drug has to make back all the money that was required for its development, plus bring profits to cover all the R&D that all those failed drugs have as well. So you've got to cover all those scientists working on drugs that don't make it to the marketplace. As I mentioned, that the chart for growth of sales for pharmaceuticals flattens in 2012, and that's because a group of blockbuster drugs had their patents expire, and the sales went to generics. So Lipitor, which for many years was the #1 selling patented drug, brought out by Pfizer, has come off patent, and a lot of the sales went to generics instead. Singulair, which is also came off patent. Plavix, which is a blood clotting drug, came off patent, and Seroquel IR also came off patent. So these drugs all now have a generic version that's available, which is great if what you're trying to do is use the treatment and you were paying $250 to $500 a month for a pharmaceutical, and now you can get it for $50 a month or $20 a month. It's a better deal for people when the drugs come off patent. Plus, by then they know a lot about the history of the drug, and they can recommend it safely. So as I mentioned, the stages of drug development are drug discovery, where you screen for the active compounds; drug development, where you look at the in vitro and animal trials, and you get a lot of failures. Most of the things you discover during screening are failures. They're not going to go on. And in vitro and animal trials, even more drugs that look promising as screening are going to be rejected. When you start in the clinical trials, a fair number of drugs fail at the phase 1 clinical trial. And then once you're through clinical trials, you still have to scale up manufacturing and have quality assurance for your manufacturing. So there's a lot of complicating factors for manufacturing a drug, especially biological drugs. And then you also have to have what are called marketing applications. So part of what you get approved by the FDA is what you say the drug is going to be useful for, at what dosage, and at what level of purity, and how effective you expect the drug to be. So the FDA will approve your drug, but they won't approve it to be used for everything. They'll approve it to be used for specific applications. So in the way they do this is with the new drug application, or NDA. And so the NDA is the way that a biotech or pharmaceutical company formally requests that the Food and Drug Administration approves a new pharmaceutical for sale in the United States. So the purpose of the NDA is to provide enough information to let the FDA reach the following key decisions. Is the drug safe and effective in its proposed use, and do the drug's benefits outweigh its risk? There are always side effects to drugs. When you take a drug, there's always some people who may potentially have a risk for using the drug. And then you want to write up what is called the package insert. So the drug's proposed labeling then has to be appropriate. What should the package insert say about the drug? What are the side effects? What are the dosages? What are the things that you shouldn't take this drug along with that drug, complicating the drug package insert. And finally are the manufacturing methods and the controls used to maintain the drug's quality adequate to ensure that the drug's identity, strength, quality, and purity are the same batch after batch. Can you make the drug reproducibly? And that's the problem for the biologicals. That's why it's harder to have a generic in the biologicals, because how the cells grow, the bacteria that grow the compound you're planning to purify, or the yeast that grows the compound you're going to purify, or the animal cells grow that compound, could be more variable, and so each biological may need more extensive FDA testing to ensure that there aren't side products that co-purify with the molecule. So I had mentioned those clinical trials a couple times. So in the phase 1 clinical trials, it's the first time that the drug is used in humans. And so it's really more of a safety study and a dose-finding study. And they're studying the pharmacokinetics. So how is the drug processed and broken down in humans? How long does it last? Can you give the drug once a day? Can you give the drug, do you have to give the drug twice a day because the product breaks down that's biologically active? Do you have to give the drug 4 times a day? How often do you have to take that drug? Ideally, we like drugs that you take once a day, and but many drugs aren't biologically stable long enough. Phase 2 clinical trials, now you're using it in populations with the disease. In chemotherapy drugs, they often use individuals with the disease for the phase 1 clinical trials as well. But in other drugs, they may do some of the phase 1 clinical trials without actually having the disease, just to show that they're safe. So phase 2 clinical trials have a small sample size, and those individuals are studied intensely. In phase 3 clinical trials, there's large-scale studies. Thousands of people are taking the drug in the phase 3 clinical trial, and those individuals have the disease that you're trying to treat, but this is still pre-Food and Drug Administration filing. So you would rather have the drug fail early in its development, not late in development, because you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on those phase 3 clinical trials. Now, you have to continue to monitor the drug once it's out and the FDA has approved it, and they call those phase 4 clinical trials. So these are introducing the drug to new populations. For example, when they came out with a vaccination against human papillomavirus, it was initially only approved for girls, and then they had to do additional trials to approve it for use in boys, to show that it was safe and efficacious in boys to prevent their getting various kinds of cancer. So sometimes a drug will come out that is useful in, for example, fighting autoimmune disease. They might find it works for arthritis, and then they want to see if it works for another autoimmune disease besides arthritis. So those additional indications would be part of the clinical trials as well. So this diagram, also from the scientists, shows that startup companies require investment in order to accomplish their research goals. And if they spend all their money on research that doesn't lead to progress, then the investors aren't going to continue to fund them. So unless you pick a good candidate to pursue, you're not going to continually get reinvestment that will take you towards the next step of the trials. So if you have an idea, you have to work on an idea that the investors think is worth the money. So when you're starting a biotech company or a small drug company, you have founders. Those founders can be people working in universities or academic labs. they are usually people who are skilled in technology. And in some cases, the founders may be a small side company that a large pharma type company sets up to be a startup company. So they'll sometimes spin out a smaller company just to give people a chance to focus without getting caught up in the big company. So that small biotech startup company, the founders bring intellectual property. They bring the concepts, the ideas, the patents in some cases. And then the seed investors are going to give them some startup capital. Then as they grow, they're going to contact people who are going to be able to continue to invest in the company. And so that initial company, they're going to their family and friends, they're going to angel investors, they might be using government grants, but as they go along they need venture investors. And those are going to be people with a great deal of wealth who are going to invest in risky ventures. And they could be corporations who also are investing in the riskier ventures. Then over time, the growth investors, as you're approaching phase 2 and moving towards that, those people are going to be hedge funds, corporate venture capital, and venture institutions. And then as you get to be a bigger company, there's going to be public capital as you go public. And then mutual funds will invest in you, hedge funds will invest in you, and you'll become an independent public biotechnology company. Or another alternative is a large pharmaceutical company will buy you up and then you're acquired. So as you go along, you're either going to become a successful company or you're going to be acquired. If you don't continue to get investment, there's a little arrow going off to being a failed biotech company. So when you're starting out as a beginning company, you need an idea, some relevant technical and management expertise, and you need capital. You need structure, you need management. As you go from being an idea, you need to found a company, move into a clear development implementation plan, and put together some seed capital. You have to raise funds. And very often in your infancy, the investors are going to want to see somebody with experience from other companies come in and be the CEO or lead the management team. During the growth phase, as you're getting closer towards bringing your product to a clinical trial, you're going to have a good portfolio of patents, you're going to be acquiring clinical data, you're going to have supportive venture capital members who will be on your board of directors, and they'll help you to raise funds for larger clinical trials. You're going to have data that you can show them that your idea is a good idea because it's working in your clinical trials. And you're going to need additional expertise as you go towards manufacturing. And then when you enter maturity, you're going to have point of care type data. You're going to have a pipeline of additional drug candidates that are moving through the system. You're maybe going to have a corporate organization. You're going to have a sales force. And you're going to need even more capital investment, so you're maybe going to take your company public. And when you take your company public, then the people who are your founders and your investors from venture capital are going to be able to cash in their stock because now it'll be publicly traded, and they're going to have a big payday for their risk that they took in your growing company. And if your growing company fails, all those venture capital's monies never come back to them. So they're taking a risk and they get a big payday. So if you're the founder, you might have a really good idea, and that intellectual property might be worth maybe a value of $1 million. The seed capital investors are going to invest $2 million in that, so now your startup company is considered to be worth $3 million. So the founder gets about a third of that, and the seed investors get 2/3 of it. So as you go to your startup then, you do some of the research as you advance to having drug candidates, and now maybe your research looks promising, so your valuation of your company is worth more. Now you go from a $3 million valuation to a $9 million valuation. So then you get venture investors that put some money in a Series A capital. They get some of the stock. They put in another $15 million. Now your company is worth $24 million. So as a founder, your investment, you now only own 13% of the company. Before, you used to own 33% of the company. The seed investors who were in the early rounds, now they used to own 67% of the company. Now they only own 25%. And the venture investors own 62% of the company. So this founder's stake has been diluted. They used to own 100%, and now they own 13% after 2 rounds of investment. But the value has increased from $1 million to $3 million. So ideally, even though you're being diluted out, the overall value of the company goes up, and so your percentage of the company is still worth more money than your original idea. So now let's take a minute to talk about who are the Food and Drug Administration exactly. We've talked about how their role in all this process is very important. So you can click on FDA.gov. They are an agency within the Department of Health and Human Services. And this is their mission statement. The FDA is responsible for protecting the public health by assuring the safety, efficacy, and security of human and veterinary drugs, biological products, medical devices, our nation's food supply, cosmetics, and products that emit radiation. The FDA is also responsible for advancing the public health by helping to speed innovations that make medicines and food more effective, safer, and more affordable, and helping the public get accurate science-based information they need to use medicines and foods to improve their health. So a shorter mission statement from the FDA would be protecting consumers, promoting public health. So the FDA has a lot of acronyms, a lot of 3-letter abbreviations. So it is an alphabet soup. So when you're using the FDA, you need, our textbook has a glossary in the back, and it's always helpful to jot down what some of these 3-letter acronyms mean. And on the tests for our class in 355, one of the test questions I'm sure I'll give you is, what are some of the key acronyms? And because everything uses these acronyms, you really have to know what the acronyms mean. So it's not sufficient just to know what an IND, you have to know that an IND is a new drug approval form. So you have to know the acronyms. So the FDA regulated products are about 25 cents out of every dollar that the consumer spent. So the FDA is regulating a large amount of commerce in the United States. So those products range from the food to medical and surgical devices, drugs, and the machines that they use for PET scans or radiation therapy, X-rays. So FDA regulated products are over $1 trillion a year. Now we mentioned that the drugs, the ethical drugs, are approaching $1 trillion. 100 billion. They're at 900 billion, so they're getting close to $1 trillion a year. So some products, new drugs, complex medical devices, must be proven safe and effective. Other products, like X-ray machines and microwave ovens, must measure up to performance standards. And since microwave ovens emit radiation, they're regulated by the FDA. Some products, like cosmetics and dietary supplements, can be marketed without prior approval. But if you sell an unsafe cosmetic or an unsafe dietary supplement, the FDA can shut you down. So the level of oversight the FDA has of all these different products is dictated by the laws that are established and the relative risks that the products pose to the consumers. So taking a dietary supplement is not as risky, or it shouldn't be as risky. Putting a new brand of mascara on shouldn't be as risky as taking a new drug for diabetes. So one big question the FDA always has to ask, especially with drugs being developed and biologicals being developed, is do the benefits of taking this drug outweigh the risks? So you need science-based, efficient risk management that will let the FDA have the most health promotion and protection at the least cost to the public. So no regulated product is completely risk-free. So these judgments are important. So the FDA will allow a product to present more risk if its potential benefit is great. So if you have a serious life-threatening condition like pancreatic cancer, which it's very difficult to survive, the 5-year survival rate for pancreatic cancer is not very good. So if you could come out with a new chemotherapy or biological treatment for pancreatic cancer, stage 2 or stage 3 pancreatic cancer, that improved people's lives, even if it only helped a third of people, even if it had some risks to taking the drug, that drug would be considered a valuable drug because that's such a life-threatening disease. So I've mentioned that the FDA regulates the food supply, and they make sure all those ingredients are safe and free of contaminants like bacteria, chemicals, or harmful substances. And the FDA approves new food additives before they can be used in foods. And they also monitor the safety of dietary supplements and the content of infant formulas. When you're giving your child infant formula, the FDA is regulating that. And medical foods, so foods that are intended to have a biological benefit. So within the FDA, there's a variety of key subdivisions. So there's the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, CBER, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CDHR, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, CDER, and then the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, CFSAN. And then in addition, there's a Center on Toxicological Research, Veterinary Medicine. There's the Office of the Chief Counsel, the Office of the Commissioner, and the Office of Regulatory Affairs. So the big thing is, are these products safe and effective before they're used by patients? So the medicines then are used for the treatment and prevention of disease, and the biologics, they can be part of medicine, or they can be these other products like vaccines, which are used for providing immunity to viral disease, blood products used for transfusions, or purified products that, like clotting factors, that are purified from blood and then administered, or biotechnology products purified from cell cultures, or DNA products that are used for gene therapy, or cellular products that are used for stem cell treatments. Those would be biologics. Medical devices would be, for the most part, viewed on how intrusive they are. So for example, in the simplest form, a medical device could be a blood pressure cuff, where you want to make sure it's effective at measuring blood pressure. But something that's going to be implanted into you, like a heart pacemaker or a dialysis machine that's going to be hooked up and dialyze the toxins from your blood, those are going to be reviewed more carefully by the agency. If what they're issuing is a bedpan, even though that's a medical device, it's not going to need that much review. So the FDA protects the public from unnecessary exposure to radiation from electronic products. So a lot of those are going to be things like microwave ovens and cell phones, and other ones are going to be more traditional medical products like x-ray equipment, lasers, ultrasound, and MRI machines. So I have a link here to an article about our local hospital where the FDA had an investigation because they had overridden the controls and it were irradiating patients. They were trying to do images of the brains of people who'd had a stroke, and in order to get a better image, they'd up the amount of radiation that they were using. And those individuals wound up with too much radiation to their brain. So the FDA basically shut down my local hospital from irradiating people with too much radiation. So the FDA also monitors mammography facilities to make sure their equipment is safe and that they're properly run, because mammography exposes you to some radiation. They also regulate veterinary drugs and devices, as well as drugs for humans. Veterinary medical devices don't have to be pre-approved before marketing, but they must still be safe, effective, and properly labeled. Livestock drugs, in particular, are evaluated for their safety to the environment and to the people who are going to eat the animal products. So if they're giving antibiotics to the livestock, they want to make sure the antibiotics don't go out and cause antibiotic-resistant bacteria to develop. So the FDA has an interest in several ways in the livestock drugs. And they monitor the cosmetics to make sure they're safe and properly labeled. These products and their ingredients are not reviewed or approved by the FDA, and they don't require safety testing. So a lot of cosmetic companies do safety testing on their products, but the FDA is not mandating what those safety tests should be. So the FDA regulates the product label. So the consumers rely on the product label to know what the product is and how to use it. And so the regulation of the labels is very important. So the FDA is making sure the labels are truthful and provide usable information for consumers so they can make healthy, safe decisions when using the product. So the Food and Drugs Act of 1906 was one of the first authorizations of the FDA to regulate foods and drugs. And that's because state drugs were ineffective because they could only regulate the safety of a particular state. And if you had food or drugs made in New Jersey and then shipped them across the Hudson River to New York City, they weren't regulated then. So one of the first muckraker novels was a novel by Upton Sinclair called The Jungle, where he talked about slaughterhouses and how dirty they were, basically, and how adulterated the food was coming out of the slaughterhouses. So that led to concern about the safety of food. So those first consumer laws made it illegal to distribute misbranded or adulterated food or drinks and drugs across state lines. And there was a concern about revealing which products contained addictive substances, like Coca-Cola used to contain coca leaves. So they were trying to get those things labeled. So if you were taking a tonic and then it turned out to contain morphine, they'd want to let you know that so that you would realize you could become addicted to that tonic. So other drug regulations came out over time. The Shirley Amendment in 1912 said you couldn't make false or fraudulent therapeutic claims on the label. And then in 1938 there was a major overhaul of drug regulation with the passage of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is referred to as the FD&AC. So one of the reasons for this was that ethylene glycol, which is a component of antifreeze, was included in a medication that killed hundreds of children. And ethylene glycol still keeps showing up in drugs too, because apparently people buy the wrong raw material and put it in these drugs. So they also said that new drugs had to obtain pre-market approval from the FDA, and that approval was based on safety. So it wasn't just enough to show it was efficacious, they had to show that it was safe. And part of the reason that was is because compounds that were resuspended in other carrier chemicals, the carrier chemicals had to be shown to be safe as well. Then in 1962, the Kefauver Amendment required that manufacturers prove both safety and efficacy. And since 1962, this new drug approval, or NDA testing, has required lengthening from as much as 5 to 10 years. It's pretty hard to bring out a new drug in less than 10 years. So much of recent legislation has been to try and improve the inefficiency and deficiencies of FD&CA. So in 1984, the Hatch-Waxman Act passed, which created abbreviated NDAs to make it easier for generics to be marketed after their patents expire. So if you're going to bring out a generic drug, you still need Food and Drug Administration approval, even though the patent has been published and supposedly it's revealed how to make that drug. But there might have been improvements in the process that you might not follow that process exactly the same. So they do want to approve your generic version. And in exchange for making it easier to bring out generics, the Hatch-Waxman allowed patent extensions that would let you extend your patent equal to the time necessary to obtain FDA approval. So if you brought out a drug and it took you 10 years to get FDA approval, then you could extend your patent by that amount of time. However, the new drug development process is not all just FDA. So the new drug development process includes all the screening and the non-clinical testing, the white mice. So in 1988, Congress passed the Prescription Drug Marketing Act. And this act is designed to regulate the marketing practices of pharmaceutical companies and distributors. So in other words, prescriptions should be given on medical need, not pecuniary emoluments given to healthcare providers. So in other words, they couldn't give away free samples, they couldn't give away all kinds of bribes to doctors to convince them to prescribe drugs. And it maintains storage and accounting standards for the drug samples that the physicians are allowed to obtain. So physicians can get sample drugs, which they can give you to try to see if you're going to have a beneficial effect of the drug. And it required that drug wholesalers be licensed by the state, and many of the regulations authorized by the PDMA have still not been enacted by the HHS. So the Prescription Drug Act is a broader regulatory power than has completely been enacted. So in 1997, Congress passed the Food and Drug Administration Act, which accelerated approvals for new drugs that had high potential for saving lives where there were no other alternatives. So a lot of those improvements in pushing the FDA were to push through drugs for HIV. So because HIV was so bad, they wanted to get new treatments out as fast as possible. So in 1990, Congress passed the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act, and this regulated claims made on labels of food manufacturers. So if you said that your oatmeal would prevent high cholesterol, and you wanted to use oatmeal as a food additive to prevent high cholesterol, or you wanted to fortify a food product with a vitamin, you had to follow this Nutrition Labeling and Education Act that regulated the food labels. And it also regulated language such as natural or low fat or jumbo. So in 1994, the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act was passed, which regulated food labels and health claims made by dietary supplement manufacturers. And so a dietary supplement could be a vitamin, a mineral, herbs, amino acids, or some combination of those. And they're intended for ingestion as pills or tablets or liquids, and they're labeled as a dietary supplement. So under this act, the FDA had some regulation over those. And they regulate those. It's not possible to sell them then as curing cancer. The appropriate health claims had to be authorized by the FDA. And if you made health claims, you had to substantiate them to the FDA. And the dietary supplements have to say what the ingredients are, and they must provide nutritional labeling. In other words, what kind of vitamins, what kind of calories, what's in the dietary supplement. So one aspect of drug regulation that the FDA doesn't cover that much is off-label prescriptions. An example of this might be a chemotherapy drug that's prescribed for breast cancer, and its mode of action is to work on a particular receptor. And you might find out that that same receptor was involved in another type of cancer, so maybe ovarian cancer. So you would off-label do a test to see whether or not the breast cancer drug worked on this particular category of ovarian cancer. So the FDA doesn't regulate the practice of medicine, so a physician could prescribe the off-label purpose, but they can't be promoted. So in other words, you can't put an advertisement on TV saying, you know, this drug is also good for ovarian cancer. So the pharmaceutical company can't advertise it and can't put that on the package insert as one of the approved uses of the drug. But in the literature about the drugs, you could write a scholarly article and talk about using it off-label. And with the Human Genome Project, it's identifying new potential off-label uses for drugs based on really understanding the mechanism of action of the drugs. So drugs are being distributed, usually the ethical drugs are distributed through the pharmacy system, but the drug distribution is changing with the internet. So there's websites on the internet that offer drugs and prescriptions, and there's also insurance companies that encourage you to receive your drugs from large companies that will cut you a price. They're large pharmaceutical companies that will ship the drugs to you. So for example, my husband is a veteran, and he takes a drug for diabetes, and the federal VA sends him his drugs in the mail. So he gets 3 months of his diabetes medication in the mail shipped to him when his prescription is renewed. And that saves the government money because they don't have to pay for a pharmacy's overhead. So when I go down to my local drugstore, my local Fruth pharmacy to pick up my prescriptions, part of the cost of my prescriptions covering the overhead of having the drugstore. And so the drugstore sells other things besides drugs to help with their overhead, but some of the cost of the drugs that I buy is paying for their physical overhead. So, and because each state licenses the doctors and the pharmacists, then who's overseeing the online drug distributors? So it becomes again somewhat buyer beware, caveat emptor. So you can also go to Mexico or Canada and buy some drugs and bring them in and save money because maybe the drugs are cheaper or a generic's been approved in those countries and it hasn't been approved in our country. Or you could buy a drug that's not even approved in our country, but maybe it's approved in Europe, and then you'd go to Canada or Mexico and buy that drug and bring it back in. So the FDA then isn't really regulating all this. That's really being regulated by the hodgepodge of state rules. So those websites then offer patients opportunities to make medical decisions. So one thing that this means is that if you get a prescription drug and it has a painkiller effect, those people who are really addicted to those drugs can just buy them off the internet. They don't have to go to a drug dealer. They can buy their drugs off the internet. And the facilities for manufacturing, storing, and transporting the drugs that are sold by the drug websites are not inspected by the FDA. State licensing requirements are actually a lot tighter, and most of the websites that are selling a lot of these drugs are not legal. The verified internet pharmacy practice sites, or VIP sites, those pharmacies comply with the licensing and inspection requirements of their state, and also each state where they dispense and sell pharmaceuticals. And part of what's required under the HIPAA are patient rights to privacy, authentication and security of prescription orders, adherence to recognized quality assurance policies, and provision of meaningful consultation between the patients and the pharmacists. So if you're getting your drugs from an online company, who's telling you, well, your other drugs that you're taking could have a bad interaction with this drug? Or if you're having a bad interaction, a pharmacist at your local pharmacy will sit down and consult with you on your bad side effects, whereas the internet pharmacy, unless it's one of these VIPS approved sites, those companies will not help you with your problems with side effects. So we want drugs to be cheaper, but we do need drugs to be safe. So, as I said, the HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996, that provides for privacy of medical information, and it doesn't solve all the medical privacy issues. So, and it helps people who switch from jobs not lose their health insurance, but it didn't solve all the medical privacy issues out there. So I'm going to stop here, and we'll talk about how the FDA actually does its job when we resume. So, thank you.